Is Facebook making us lonely? Yvette Vickers, a former Playboy playmate and B movie star, best known for her role in the Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, would have been 83 last August, but nobody knows exactly how old she was when she died. According to the Los Angeles coroner's report, she lay dead for the better part of a year before a neighbor and fellow actress, a woman named Susan Savage, noticed cobwebs and yellowing letters in her mailbox, reached through a broken window to unlock the door, and pushed her way through the piles of junk mail and mounds of clothing that barricaded the house. Upstairs, she found Vickers' body, mummified, near a heater that was still running. Her computer was on too, its glow permeating the empty space. The Los Angeles Times posted a story headlined, "Mummified Body of Former Playboy Playmate Yvette Vickers Found in Her Benedict Canyon Home," which quickly went viral. Within 2 weeks, by Technorati's count, Vickers' lonesome death was already the subject of 16,057 Facebook posts and 881 tweets. She had long been a horror movie icon, a symbol of Hollywood's capacity to exploit our most basic fears in the silliest ways. Now she was an icon of a new and different kind of horror, our growing fear of loneliness. Certainly, she received much more attention in death than she did in the final years of her life. With no children, no religious group, no immediate social circle of any kind, she had begun, as an elderly woman, to look elsewhere for companionship. Savage later told Los Angeles Magazine that she had searched Vickers' phone bills for clues about her life that led to such an end. In the months before her grotesque death, Vickers had made calls not to friends or family, but to distant fans who had found her through fan conventions and internet sites. Vickers' web of connections had grown broader but shallower, as has happened for many of us. We are living in an isolation that would have been unimaginable to our ancestors, and yet we have never been more accessible. Over the past 3 decades, technology has delivered to us a world in which we need not be out of contact for a fraction of a moment. In 2010, at the cost of $300 million, 800 miles of fiber optic cable was laid between the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and the New York Stock Exchange to shave 3 milliseconds off trading times. Yet within this world of instant and absolute communication, unbounded by limits of time or space, we suffer from unprecedented alienation. We have never been more detached from one another or lonelier. In a world consumed by ever more novel modes of socializing, we have less and less actual society. We live in an accelerating contradiction. The more connected we become, the lonelier we are. We were promised a global village, and instead we inhabit the drab cul-de-sacs and endless freeways of a vast suburb of information. At the forefront of all this unexpected lonely interactivity is Facebook, with 845 million users and 3.7 billion in revenue last year. The company hopes to raise $5 billion in an initial public offering later this spring, which will make it by far the largest internet IPO in history. Some recent estimates put the company's potential value at $100 billion, which would make it larger than the global coffee industry, one addiction preparing to surpass the other. Facebook's scale and reach are hard to comprehend. Last summer, Facebook became, by some counts, the first website to receive 1 trillion page views in a month. In the last 3 months of 2011, users generated an average of 2.7 billion likes and comments every day. On whatever scale you care to judge Facebook, as a company, as a culture, as a country, it is vast beyond imagination. Despite its immense popularity, or more likely because of it, Facebook has, from the beginning, been under something of a cloud of suspicion. The depiction of Mark Zuckerberg in the social network as a bastard with symptoms of Asperger's syndrome was nonsense, but it felt true. It felt true to Facebook, if not to Zuckerberg. The film's most indelible scene, the one that may well have earned it an Oscar, was the final silent shot of an anomic Zuckerberg sending out a friend request to his ex-girlfriend, then waiting and clicking and waiting and clicking. A moment of super-connected loneliness preserved in amber. We have all been in that scene, transfixed by the glare of a screen hungering for response. When you sign up for Google Plus and set up your friend circle, the program specifies that you should include only your real friends, the ones you feel comfortable sharing private details with. That one little phrase, your real friends, so quaint, so charmingly mothering, perfectly encapsulates the anxieties that social media have produced. The fears that Facebook is interfering with our real friendships, distancing us from each other, making us lonelier, and that social networking might be spreading the very isolation it seemed designed to conquer. Facebook arrived in the middle of a dramatic increase in the quantity and intensity of human loneliness, a rise that initially made the site's promise of greater connection seem deeply attractive. Americans are more solitary than ever before. In 1950, less than 10% of American households contained only one person. By 2010, nearly 27% of households had just one person. Solitary living does not guarantee a life of unhappiness, of course. In his recent book about the trend toward living alone, Eric Kleinberg, a sociologist at NYU, writes, reams of published research show that it's the quality, not the quantity of social interaction, that best predicts loneliness. True. But before we begin the fantasies of happily eccentric singledom, of divorcees dropping by their knitting circles after work for glasses of Drew Barrymore Pinot Grigio, or recent college graduates with perfectly articulated, steampunk-themed 300 square foot apartments organizing croquet matches with their book clubs, we should recognize that it is not just isolation that is rising sharply, it's loneliness too. And loneliness makes us miserable. We know intuitively that loneliness and being alone are not the same thing. Solitude can be lovely. Crowded parties can be agony. We also know, thanks to a growing body of research on the topic, that loneliness is not a matter of external contradictions. It is a psychological state. In 2005, analysis of data from a longitudinal study of Dutch twins showed that the tendency toward loneliness has roughly the same genetic component as other psychological problems such as neuroticism or anxiety. Still, loneliness is slippery, a difficult state to define or diagnose. The best tool yet developed for measuring the condition is a UCLA loneliness scale, a series of 20 questions that all begin with this formulation. How often do you feel, as in, how often do you feel that you are in tune with the people around you? And how often do you feel that your lack of companionship? Measuring the condition in these terms, various studies have shown loneliness rising drastically over a very short period of recent history. A 2010 AARP survey found that 35% of adults older than 45 were chronically lonely, as opposed to 20% of a similar group only a decade earlier. According to a major study by a leading scholar of the subject, roughly 20% of Americans, about 60 million people, are unhappy with their lives because of loneliness. Across the Western world, physicians and nurses have begun to speak openly of an epidemic of loneliness. The new studies on loneliness are beginning to yield some surprising preliminary findings about its mechanisms. Almost every factor that one might assume affects loneliness does so only some of the time, and only under certain circumstances. People who are married are less lonely than single people, one journal article suggests, but only if their spouses are confidants. If one's spouse is not a confidant, marriage may not decrease loneliness. A belief in God might help, or it might not, as a 1990 German study comparing levels of religious feeling and levels of loneliness discovered. Active believers who saw God as abstract and helpful rather than as a wrathful, immediate presence were less lonely. The mere belief in God, the researchers concluded, was relatively independent of loneliness. But it is clear that social interaction matters. Loneliness and being alone are not the same thing, but both are on the rise. We meet fewer people, we gather less, and when we gather, our bonds are less meaningful and less easy. The decrease in confidence, that is, in quality social connections, has been dramatic over the past 25 years. In one survey, the mean size of networks of personal confidants decreased from 2.94 people in 1985 to 2.08 in 2004. Similarly, in 1985, only 10% of Americans said they had no one with whom to discuss important matters, and 15% said they had only one such good friend. By 2004, 25% had nobody to talk to, and 20% had only one confidant. In the face of this social disintegration, we have essentially hired an army of replacement confidants, an entire class of professional careers. As Ronald Dworkin pointed out in a 2010 paper for the Hoover Institution in the late 40s, the United States was home to 2,500 clinical psychologists, 30,000 social workers, and fewer than 500 marriage and family therapists. As of 2010, the country had 77,000 clinical psychologists, 192,000 clinical social workers, 400,000 non-clinical social workers, 50,000 marriage and family therapists, 105,000 mental health counselors, 220,000 substance abuse counselors, 17,000 nurse psychotherapists, and 30,000 life coaches. The majority of patients in therapy do not warrant a psychiatric diagnosis. This raft of psychic servants is helping us through what used to be called regular problems. We have outsourced the work of everyday caring. We need professional carers more and more because the threat of societal breakdown, once principally a matter of nostalgic lament, has morphed into an issue of public health. Being lonely is extremely bad for your health. If you're lonely, you're more likely to be put in a geriatric home at an earlier age than a similar person who isn't lonely. You're less likely to exercise. You're more likely to be obese. You're less likely to survive a serious operation and more likely to have hormonal imbalances. You are at a greater risk of inflammation. Your memory may be worse. You are more likely to be depressed, to sleep badly, and to suffer dementia and general cognitive decline. Loneliness may not have killed Yvette Vickers, but it has been linked to a greater probability of having the kind of heart condition that did kill her. And yet, despite its deleterious effect on health, loneliness is one of the first things ordinary Americans spend their money achieving. With money, you flee the cramped city to a house in the suburbs, or, if you can afford it, a McMansion in the exurbs, inevitably spending more time in your car. Loneliness is, at the American core, a byproduct of a long-standing national appetite for independence. The pilgrims who left Europe willingly abandoned the bonds and strictures of a society that could not accept their right to be different. They did not seek out loneliness, but they accepted it as the price of their autonomy. The cowboys who set off to explore a seemingly endless frontier likewise traded away personal ties in favor of pride and self-respect. The ultimate American icon is the astronaut. Who is more heroic or more alone? The price of self-determination and self-reliance has often been loneliness, but Americans have always been willing to pay that price. Loneliness certainly is not something that Facebook or Twitter or any of the lesser forms of social media is doing to us. We are doing it to ourselves. Casting technology as some vague and personal spirit of history forcing our actions is a weak excuse. We make decisions about how we use our machines, not the other way around. Every time I shop at my local grocery store, I am faced with a choice. I can buy my groceries from a human being or from a machine. I always, without exception, choose a machine. It's faster and more efficient, I tell myself, but the truth is that I prefer not having to wait with the other customers who are lined up alongside the conveyor belt. The hipster mom who disapproves of my high carbon footprint pineapple, the lady who tenses to the point of tears while she waits to see if the gods of the credit card machine will accept or decline, the old man whose clumsy feebleness requires a patience that I don't possess. Much better to bypass the whole circus and just ring up the groceries myself. Our omnipresent new technologies lure us toward increasingly superficial connections at exactly the same moment that they make avoiding the mess of human interaction easy. The beauty of Facebook, the source of its power, is that it enables us to be social while sparing us the embarrassing reality of society. The accidental revelations we make at parties, the awkward pauses, the farting and the spilled drinks, and the general gaucher of face to face contact. Instead, we have the lovely smoothness of a seemingly social machine. Everything's so simple: status updates, pictures, your wall. A considerable part of Facebook's appeal stems from its miraculous fusion with intimacy, or the illusion of distance with the illusion of intimacy. Our online communities become engines of self image, and self image becomes the engine of community. The real danger with Facebook is not that it allows us to isolate ourselves, but that by mixing our appetite for isolation with our vanity, it threatens to alter the very nature of solitude. The new isolation is not of the kind that Americans once idealized. The lonesomeness of the proudly nonconformist, independent minded, solitary stoic, or that of the astronaut who blasts into new worlds. Facebook's isolation is a grind. What's truly staggering about Facebook usage is not its volume, 750 million photographs uploaded over a single weekend, but the constancy of the performance it demands. More than half its users, and 1 of every 13 people on Earth is a Facebook user, log on every day. According to among 18 to 34-year-olds, nearly half check Facebook minutes after waking up, and 28% do so before getting out of bed. The relentlessness is what is so new, so potentially transformative. Facebook never takes a break. We never take a break. Human beings have always created elaborate acts of self-presentation, but not all the time, not every morning before we even pour a cup of coffee. Yvette Vickers' computer was on when she died. Nostalgia for the good old days of disconnection would not just be pointless, it would be hypocritical and ungrateful. But the very magic of the new machines, the efficiency and elegance with which they serve us, obscures what isn't being served, everything that matters. What Facebook has revealed about human nature, and this is not a minor revelation, is that a connection is not the same thing as a bond, and that instant and total connection is no salvation, no ticket to a happier, better world, or a more liberated version of humanity. Solitude used to be good for self-reflection and self-reinvention. But now we are left thinking about who we are all the time without ever really thinking about who we are. Facebook denies us a pleasure whose profundity we had underestimated. The chance to forget about ourselves for a while. The chance to disconnect.